Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking the life of a guy whose name is literally synonymous with the word genius. But here's the crazy irony we're going to explore. Michelangelo was a legendary artist defined just as much by his intense, sometimes violent rivalries and his absolute, bitter hatred for the very medium that made him immortal. It's a pretty powerful lesson in how our greatest legacy can sometimes come from the work we resist doing the most. Let's dive right in.
Now here's the ultimate paradox. How on earth did a man who didn't even consider himself a painter by trade pull off the most famous painted ceiling in human history? The creator of the Sistine Chapel viewed himself purely as a sculptor, period. Yet, he gave us one of the world's most iconic masterpieces. So how did this actually happen?
Chapter 1. The Reluctant Painter. Born in 1475, his father actually beat him for preferring art over a respectable career in law or the church. Young Michelangelo fiercely rebelled against those social ambitions, totally drawn to the cultural explosion happening in Florence.
His early environment kind of set him up for this. He was raised by a wet nurse at a family farm in a village famous for its stone quarries. He even joked later on that it was no coincidence he became a sculptor. By age 12, his talent was undeniable, and he apprenticed under the famous painter Ghirlandaio. And he had this incredible mischievous streak. He actually flawlessly faked a drawing by his master and returned the copy without Ghirlandaio even noticing. That early brilliance built up a monumental, almost dangerous level of confidence.
Chapter 2. Master of the Marble. A meteoric rise defined by intense rivalries, physical fights, and undeniable skill, because painting was never his true love.
So he soon ends up in Lorenzo the Magnificent's prestigious sculpture garden. The ambition on this kid was wild. Once, as a teenager, he carved an old laughing faun with a full set of teeth. When Lorenzo de' Medici points out that old men usually lose their teeth, what does Michelangelo do? He waits for Lorenzo to leave, literally knocks some teeth out of his own sculpture, and shows it off to win his approval. But that arrogance definitely had a price. He mocked an older apprentice named Pietro Torrigiano, who responded by punching Michelangelo right in the face, permanently disfiguring his nose.
But hey, the talent paid off, literally. At just 25 years old, he bags the princely sum of 450 ducats to carve the Pietà in Rome. It was an absolute smash hit. The sculpture is famous not just for its breathtaking beauty, but for the strikingly youthful appearance of the Virgin Mary. And, fun fact, it's the only work Michelangelo ever actually signed. Boom! He was officially a celebrity.
Of course, with celebrity comes epic rivalries, and none was greater than his clash with Leonardo da Vinci. These two were total opposites. Leonardo was all about softer lines, shadows, and treating painting as a noble, collaborative discipline. Michelangelo? He fiercely favored sharp outlines, an intense focus on the muscular male nude, and solitary, grueling work in sculpture. They openly despised each other. In fact, Leonardo famously insulted Michelangelo's heavily muscled figures, saying they looked like a sack of walnuts. Ouch.
Chapter 3. The Sistine Chapel Struggle. The climax of his career, born out of manipulation, fleeing Rome, and bitter reluctance. And it all revolves around his tempestuous relationship with Pope Julius II.
This timeline is just pure chaos. In 1505, Pope Julius commissions him for a grand 40-statue tomb. Michelangelo spends months sourcing the marble, and then the Pope just completely loses interest. Furious and humiliated, Michelangelo literally flees Rome in 1506. The Pope basically has to force him back. Then, in 1508, the Pope assigns him to paint the cracked ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo was paranoid. He honestly believed his rival, the architect Bramante, orchestrated the gig just to watch him fail, because he was totally untested as a fresco painter.
But instead of failing, he completely reimagined the project into a massive depiction of the Old Testament. And he was miserable the entire time. He complained incessantly in letters to his family. When the first batch of wet plaster developed mold, he nearly quit. Instead, he fired his assistants and did the vital painting completely alone. And let's bust a major myth right now. He did not paint it lying down on his back. He painted it standing up, with his head painfully tilted backward for years. Pure physical torture.
Yet, the speed and anatomical brilliance were just astonishing. He knocked out the creation of Adam, one of the most recognizable images on Earth, in just 16 days. And notice this incredible detail he pulled from his illicit dissections of human bodies. God is depicted surrounded by figures inside a billowing red cloth, and that cloth is shaped exactly like a human brain. Mind-blowing.
All that solitary agony paid off. It translated into a staggering 3,000 ducat fee paid by the Pope when the ceiling was unveiled in 1512.
Michelangelo was now the undisputed greatest living artist in Italy, completely stepping out of the shadows of Leonardo and Raphael.
Chapter 4. Architecture and Later Years. Navigating wars, political collapse, and a revolving door of demanding popes.
Surviving as an artist during the Renaissance really meant adapting, because your fortunes constantly shifted depending on who wore the papal crown. With Julius II, it was tempestuous and demanding. Then comes Pope Leo X, who was distant and gave him frustrating, stalled projects like the San Lorenzo facade. Clement VII was intellectually engaged but a pretty poor politician, commissioning the Laurentian Library. And finally, Pope Paul III was deeply supportive, backing his highly controversial later works. Michelangelo had to adapt his entire career to survive the whims of these incredibly powerful men.
And through it all, his intimidating aura just grew. I absolutely love this quote from his friend Sebastiano del Piombo, who wrote to him saying, "He knows you and loves you, but you frighten everyone, including popes." I mean, wow! He wasn't just a servant to these patrons, he was a terrifying force of nature that even the most powerful men in Christendom tiptoed around.
The logistics alone for his grand ideas were staggering. He signed a massive 40,000 ducat contract for the San Lorenzo facade. To pull this off, he spent 2 whole years just supervising the quarrying of vast quantities of marble. It was a complete logistical nightmare, and at one point, a sliding marble column literally almost crushed him to death.
But he wasn't just working with marble and paint. In 1529, when Florence threw out the Medici and restored the Republic, this master artist was appointed governor of the city's fortifications. He designed these highly effective, low-profile, angular bastions specifically to deflect artillery fire. It helped defend the city against an imperial army siege for 10 months. It's a totally surprising side of his genius, showing that true creative problem-solving really isn't limited to just one medium.
Chapter 5. A Complicated Legacy. Nudity, grand architecture, poetry, and an uncompromising solitary nature. He eventually returns to the Sistine Chapel to paint the Last Judgement, a massive wall featuring hundreds of nude figures that totally appalled his critics. It was so bad that later artists were actually hired to paint over the offending parts. He also showed this playful, rebellious side, secretly painting himself in disguise into his final frescoes in the Cappella Paolina. And incredibly, at age 71, he's appointed chief architect of St. Peter's Basilica, redesigning the towering, iconic dome that still defines the Roman skyline today.
But his art wasn't just confined to visual mediums. Michelangelo actually penned over 300 poems during his lifetime. These verses reveal a deeply emotional, vulnerable inner life, especially in his writings dedicated to figures like the young Roman aristocrat Tommaso de' Cavalieri and his close friend Vittoria Colonna. It shows the beating heart right beneath that intimidating exterior. Michelangelo passed away in 1564 at the grand old age of 88. Unlike so many artists who die in obscurity, he was a vastly wealthy and famous man investing heavily in Florentine property and outliving his great rivals by decades. He secured a legendary, almost godlike status while he was still breathing, standing completely alone as the titan of the Renaissance. So we are left with this final thought. Was his undeniable genius really worth the cost of that difficult, solitary attitude and all those uncompleted projects? Did his terrifying temper and his refusal to delegate hold him back? Or was that uncompromising obsession the exact secret ingredient required to create the Sistine Chapel ceiling and the David? It is a fascinating question to chew on. Well, thank you for joining me for this explainer, and I urge you to keep looking closer at the art that shapes our world.